Hi, I'm Tierney Domer. I'm here with Adam Wooten. We're from DevCycle, the feature flag management platform that's built for developers with their experience in mind, so you can release faster, more often, and with confidence. Joining us here today is Charlie Groll, staff front-end engineer at Netlify, here to tell us a little bit more about some of the use cases for feature flags, as well as a bit more about their migration process, moving from away from LaunchDarkly to DevCycle. Charlie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, anytime. So just to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit more about your role?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm a staff front-end engineer, and actively on my pretty small pod, we call them pods. I'm a technical lead and lead developer, but I also act at the larger scale with throughout the engineering org and our org in general to contribute to POCs, architectural decision making, and also mentorship for other engineers and basically anything else under the sun.
Cool. Can you tell us a little bit more about your team structure?
Sure. So I said we call them pods. Our pod is a pretty small one. I'm one of three front-end engineers, and we generally have one back-end engineer. We've been switching someone out in and out, trying to get that to stick for now. But we're focused on some feature additions to app.netlify.com, which is how you interact with your deploys and your sites, and basically anything you deploy to Netlify, and how you manage your team around all that. And uh, we used to be part of the growth team. Sorry. So we we used to be the growth team. So we were trying to get people in to our platform and to stick to it and try to grow them through the life cycle to eventually bring them to bigger companies and get those companies onto Netlify. But now we're more focused on the big companies, going from the top down to try and see what our biggest clients or potential clients want, and turn that into reality.
Cool. So I guess what is your tech stack? Like what tools and technologies does the team build with?
Sure. So we're mostly, as I said, I'm a front-end developer. So most of what I work in is our TypeScript with React and Redux, kind of old school Create React app that's been ejected. So you can't really tell it's Create React app anymore, but every now and then you can poke at something and see some references. But mainly, it's a very mature app that's grown over the past, I think, 5, 6, 7 years from the ground up. And we recently have done giant conversions into TypeScript and to Tailwind. And so, as you can imagine, feature flagging has been quite the tool for us to implement, to use.
And then I guess is it a purely like client side app? Is it like running in a framework like Next.js or something like that, or you just ship in the JavaScript?
Yeah, so we've completely decoupled front end and back end. So when I said we had front end and back end engineers, we've pretty much completely decoupled. Before I said that we've had a little trouble keeping that back end position steady. So that's made me more of a full stack ish developer. But mainly throughout our org, we have front end developers and back end developers, and the ones that are focused on the app are either in the TypeScript React world with no underlying framework. It's purely just a nice React app that's held together by Redux and some internal, I don't want to say hackery, but internal homegrown meta framework stuff. And then the backend's all Ruby on Rails. So I have the pleasure of jumping between Ruby on Rails and TypeScript for my day to day, which not stressful at all.
Yeah, I'm sure it's easy to keep both of those in your head, hey? And so I guess do you do feature flagging on both sides then, like on the React side and on the Ruby side?
Yeah, so definitely on I'd say they're more often added to the front end because they're just so cheap, and we they're extremely client facing. That's not to say that our API is not client facing, because anyone with a nice Netlify login can authenticate to our API and make their own requests. That's how our CLI is built. But generally, feature flagging is done more on the front end, and if there's something being released between the two, they share the same flags. And then they're also shared throughout the rest of our code bases that I don't really touch, which are more mainly in Go.
Okay, cool. So I guess you're using like the DevCycle React SDK for the front end, and then the like the Ruby SDK on the back end. Is that right?
Yeah, and also we use the plain old vanilla JavaScript one, the Node API, SDK, because uh, with Netlify you also get the ability to just throw up AWS Lambdas functions whenever you want
Mm.
and deploy them for free. So we take advantage of that a lot, and some of those we need feature flags. And one of the ones we use internally actually is to uh, authenticate and show all of the flags for which our internal users are turned on or off. So we actually have a function that reaches out to your via your SDK, reaches out, grabs all the flags that we have for you, and then shows you the result of those.
Oh, okay, cool. So I guess can you give like some sort of like specific examples of like what you are using feature flags for? Like I guess you mentioned that you use them a lot on the front end. Like what does that kind of look like? Like what's the sort of primary use for them that you have?
Sure. Top of mind for me is we're currently working on a security related feature. I don't think we're really ready to talk about it until our next week. We have Compose coming up as a conference that we're putting on, but for now, I'll just say that I'm working on some security related things, and we're adding an entire new page for enterprises to view their security posture on as it relates to Netlify. And so adding an entire new page that'll be in our navigation. We don't want that to show for basically anyone until we're ready, but we want to be able to ship to prod. So we actually ship, I'd say, a dozen times a day as an org, probably a couple dozen, and my team maybe 6, 7, 8 times a day, just working on iterating on the new features in the new page. But we don't want to have some feature branch or put everything behind one giant flag and ship it all at once, or even no flag at all and just have to keep constantly updating main. So we have all of it in prod all the time, and that makes it nice and easy with our Netlify deploy previews, because we can turn on internally that you have to, if you can authenticate with Netlify to see Netlify, you can open up a deploy preview of the Netlify app. Yeah, I know it's a little bit of inception there,
Yeah.
but you can see basically with privileges the Netlify app as it looks like in production with the new code. So whenever we put up a PR, we can see the changes in this deploy preview before they get shipped, and it's really easy for people to be able to test. Our docs people or our designers or our PM can all log in with their normal Netlify login and see the things that are flagged with the flags turned on. But then as they go in production, we don't have to worry about them because they're all turned off. And then locally, we use the exact same flags and the same data so that we can turn it on for all developers or just a subset of developers that are on the project, or anyone else who might be running it locally.
And like, do you kind of follow the same approach every time, like the same set of people see it, or is it more like feature dependent?
I think it's highly feature dependent because we use flags from everything from just uh, small design changes. It depends on, do we want to see it in prod first and are we ready to launch this, or giant features where we've acquired an entire company and we're integrating all of their features into our core product and then releasing that all at once. So it really is from the smallest thing to the biggest thing, and yeah, it really depends. So we might open it up to just your team, just my team at the beginning, or the entire org, or basically it's just me developing and I might not open it to anyone but me. So yeah, anything in between.
Cool. Yeah, I also heard you mention that you kind of are trying to avoid like working on, like giant feature branches that aren't merged for a really long time. I'm curious if you've worked that way before, either like at Netlify or at like a previous job, and sort of like what your thoughts are about like that approach versus like the sort of continuous merged approach that you have now.
Yeah, at my previous job, we worked on feature branches, and you might have seen a twinge in my eye when that happened. And it's because it's extremely hard, and it's mainly keeping things up to date. And the longer you have it long lived, and nowadays everything goes with mono repos, and you rarely have things in isolation. So the more you have to update, and the bigger the code base is, the more of a headache you get. And then you also still need to be shipping things, because if you're doing this specifically happened to me with giant refactor. So if you're doing a giant refactor, but it's really hard to sell to whatever stakeholders you have, that you can just stop feature development for an entire quarter or two.
Mhm.
So you also have to be adding things at the same time that you're rewriting things, and doing those at the same time is hard enough without having to try and keep them in line. And yeah, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I've definitely felt the same with this with that as well. I guess last question before I hand things back to Terne is like, do you use feature flags like purely for like releasing new things? Do you ever kind of like use them for just sort of like maybe there's like a new implementation of something you're unsure about, or like you just want to like refactor some code and like sort of like safely like roll it out? Like, is that also like an approach that you take, or is it mainly just for like obscuring like new features from people?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is that we use it for almost anything, anything you can imagine. But more concrete examples would be if we have an entire any kind of redesign. So we've recently redesigned all of our navigation, and that's still in the process. So we're iterations are being released, but the first iteration was launched out, I think rolled out to maybe like all starter accounts or all like 10% of all accounts, and we kind of do it slowly like that sometimes. I've also before we were an enterprise focused team. We were, I think I said, the growth team. So we would constantly be doing experiments on subsets of our users. Maybe it's a subset of all starter users, which is our free plan, or of just enterprise, which is our highest level, biggest companies, or just any like you can imagine changing the button color. We've had simple experiments like that before, where you roll out a button color change to 50% of users and see if it tracks more engagement. And so it's super easy to just say roll this out to 50% of users, or even more complex experiments, roll it out to 10%, and then in 5 days roll it out to 30%, and then notch that up until you reach 100%. And so that way we can correlate that in our on our data side when we're collecting information on how successful this is. And basically we can say, should we be not ratcheting this up? Should we be canceling this? Is it meaningful? Is it not? And the ability to just bucket our users like that and have a system that keeps track of that is invaluable.
Can you tell us a little bit about what reusable audiences are and how your team uses them?
Sure. So for us, reusable audiences have historically been when we had back when I was that growth team was our primary focus. We had growth marketing who would go to our data team or into one of our data tools, self-service, and basically say, "Give me all users or accounts or sites that look like this." And it might be starter accounts who are owned by someone named Bob. It could be anything that you could set your mind to, and then they would export the site IDs or the user IDs or the account IDs and create an audience for them, so we could send an announcement to that person or change or upsell them on something specifically and see if that helps engagement or conversion. But more recently, since we've moved away from the growth mindset to more enterprise focused, for us, I think for me that the audiences feature really just lets me say, here's my audience for who should be seeing this during testing, because our team includes more than just the engineers on it. So I need to be able to say, all right, here's who's running docs for this specific project. Here's who's running design for this specific project. Oh, they're on vacation, so let me add another person. And I don't have to go through all of the features we're working on currently and update local, deploy previews, and production to then go in and say, all right, this person's working, so they need to be able to see this. So I have to go to every target. I would have to go to every targeting and add them separately, unless they were in an audience where I could just say local, deploy previews, and maybe even production is always going to be on for this specific audience, and that'll be our testers. And so anyone who's testing it or needs to be working on any part of the project can just automatically be included in that flag. And then as that grows larger, we can change the audience to say, all right, anyone at Netlify. So it's really easy to say the audience includes anyone with an @netlify.com email. And then that allows us to then iterate and say, like, all right, now everyone.
Gotcha. Just out of curiosity, outside of Netlify, have you used feature flags before? And if you have, what have you used them for?
Sure. From in the past jobs, I've worked at pretty big, slow corporate type tech giants that I think the main examples there would be either database-driven flags, which is not the way to go, spoiler alert, or environment variable or configuration-driven, which also is slightly better, but it's also harder to deploy and harder to track because it's not maintaining code typically. So it would either take getting a DBA to sign off on changing a flag at a release at 3 in the morning to turn everything on, which is never fun because that kind of, or getting someone who has permissions to change the environment variables, which might be an SRE or it might just be like the specific subset of all SREs or of a DBA, or who knows who owns the environment for which you're working in. But I think the lesson there is that it's really hard to work quickly and those changes are a lot slower. Whereas if I can just put all of these flags in code and then anyone with access to the system, which we also happen to give all of everyone access to DevCycle, so anyone can change a flag at any point, pretty much. And so the ability to move, it really enables our developers and our features and our product development to move lightning fast as opposed to releasing once a month or yeah. Like I said before, we release our front end gets released dozens of times per day, and I think my team specifically probably does half a dozen to a dozen releases a day.
Okay.
I guess that's like, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna say, I guess that's a pretty good segue into like I wanted to ask you sort of about how your like internal process works around feature flags, because like there's a lot of like organizational questions that have to be answered, like who's like able to make flags, like who like makes the decision of like when you need to put something behind a flag or not. So I'm just curious kind of like how that works for you.
Yeah, like I said, pretty much everyone can create flags or toggle them. We don't really gate that very heavily, and it empowers our developers to like own the features themselves instead of having to just submit requests to some ether to just say, hey, can someone turn on this flag? That was one of the big selling points for coming over to LaunchDarkly, because before from LaunchDarkly, because LaunchDarkly had seat-based pricing, and that while we also gave similar permissions to everyone over there, we really only had a certain number of seats and more engineers than seats. And also our support engineers need to be able to see what the flags are and be able to turn them on and off, because we use those to opt people in and out of features if they get into features, or if they hit a specific weird bug scenario that may just be only be, hey, the solution might be opt them into this flag so that they get around that. But so support, PMs, EMs, all of our engineers, all of that would put us in quite the pricing predicament. So now we can pretty much say anyone who needs to change these flags, there's an audit for it, and we trust the people, otherwise we wouldn't have hired you. Let's get you doing what you need to do. And so any engineer, or anyone really, but engineers can create their own flags ad hoc whenever they want. And then as long as you get approval in the PR, it's in our code base, and you have full control over how it gets launched and how things get released. So yeah.
So then I guess, do you have any tips about like sort of how to keep all that stuff organized? Like if you have all these people creating flags, like is there some sort of like naming scheme or some sort of like tagging system or something that you use to try and like keep track of everything?
Yeah, for our app, which includes the API, we have a shared bucket that all of our flags get put into. And if it's going to be in the front end at all, there are people across the internet who would love to see what we're doing ahead of time. It's happened in the past. So we actually give all of our features, I wouldn't even say code names, we just obfuscate what they are, and then name them correctly in DevCycle and in the code. But the names of the flags are all Pokemon based. And it's so you can always, there are hundreds of them, you can always find a new one that hasn't been used before. They're generally not very topical, they're just generally random. But you pick a Pokemon, and then we have a file that with a comment that just says who added it and when, and for what project. And there's always a PR you can follow it back to if you need to see who added it and why. But the cleanup of them is generally left as an exercise for the reader. So if you added it, we are hoping you'll clean it up after you're launched, which again, we have that's part of the trust thing, and we know that that's not going to be perfect, and it never is. But every now and then we'll have a nice cleanup on like a Friday, or when something else is, hey, I noticed that you didn't clean up your flag after yourself. And if it's close enough, someone like me will be nice enough to clean it up for you and then put up a PR and say, hey, can you approve this? Or just a light nudge to say, hey, you have a bunch of flags in there. So it's generally friendly. It doesn't, I'd say the code base itself that I work in, although we all share every part of it, when you own specific slices of the the product as a whole, your flags are generally in the areas that you touch most often. So I don't think they like get in the way of other people's jobs. So I wouldn't say it doesn't really create spaghetti code or anything. It just every now and then you can get, oh, this thing is gated by 4 flags, 3 of which are not being used anymore. And so that it's a nice prompt that if we all own it, we all own the cleanup of it, or we are all vested in its quality. So yeah.
Cool. And then I guess like, do you have any sort of like, I don't know, special abstractions or special helper utilities or anything like that you've introduced into the code base to kind of make it easier to work with feature flags and like hide or show components depending on the flag value?
Yeah, we don't. I think the first thing that comes to mind is like a nice hawk, a higher order component that you would imagine we could use. But I think generally we've gone the route of just giving people flags. So we have giving people hooks. So we give a use flag hook, and that's the main source of our power using DevCycle, is just a use flag with the name of it, and that gives you your value back, and then you can do whatever you want with it. It's just a nice little JavaScript variable, to usually a Boolean, but my use cases have been complicated in the past with strings and different variants. But generally, it's just, is this on or off, and show or hide, or in a nice ternary that show A, show B, and that's. But we also have, I think, a lot of the extras that we've added on come around testing. So we use React testing library and Jest. So we have to mock those out somehow for our integration test to say, if the flag is on, does it do this? If the flag is off, does it do that? And then further up the chain, we also use Cypress for browser testing. So we don't want to rely on, no matter how reliable the service is, we don't want to rely on third-party services running in our browser test environments. So we'll typically mock out what the response would look like if it hit that API. Cypress makes that nice and easy with, I think, they have a plugin system that lets us just respond with whatever we want on a test by test basis, or global if we choose. And then also, there's one more. So we use Storybook pretty heavily in Netlify, and by the makers of Chromatic, which we also use for visual regression testing. But we pretty much any time we create a new page or any new component, we tag it for, we create a story for it, so that anyone, designers, docs, anyone at all across the org can just spin up storybook.netlify.com. You can visit that if you'd like. You won't be able to get to it, but it's because it's behind the password. But any of us can go in and see that all of the components that we have that make up the entire site, from the small UI building blocks like buttons and what looks like a card or just headers, all the way up to an entire page and how it's put together from different components. And so the ability to say, to just put up a story that says, with this feature flag on, what does the story look like? And with the feature flag off, what does it look like? And so we have a higher order component there that just says, we pass it a flag and with the value of the flag, and then that gives us some confidence that it'll look as we expect it to look, especially when we turn those on for Chromatic, which is as I said, visual regression testing, which just means, hey, we'll mark things as, hey, Chromatic, take a snapshot of this, take a nice picture of it, and then it'll do some visual diffing. And if things are different when we put up a PR, it'll say, these are actually different. We need you to tell us that this is okay. And once that's done, we have a GitHub action that'll say, all right, now you can merge this, but otherwise it'll block you from merging. And so we generally, with bigger components, will use some nice higher order component mocking to say, all right, so we have a story for when the flag is on, story for when it's off, take some nice snapshots of it, and then eventually we can take out the old ones and be very confident in the results of our changes.
That's pretty interesting. So I guess like in your storybook, you actually like can like preview every component that has a feature flag sort of in its on state and its off state. And is that something you kind of do like every single time? Is it like part of the process or?
Yeah, I mean, some of the criteria, I would say it's pretty well followed, especially by our front-end devs, but we also enable anyone throughout the org to open up a PR. But part of the acceptance criteria when you're adding new things is to add stories for it. And I've just yesterday blocked a PR because it didn't add stories. And we make it super easy to spin those up, so no one's mad when you block for that. But basically, it's the name of our story might be with Rillaboom, which is again a Pokemon. So it'll be like this feature with Rillaboom, this feature without Rillaboom, and there you go. Or Pikachu if you want to get nice and so everyone can know.
I'm sure Pikachu's been used already before, right?
It was probably one of the first, and it's probably not in the code base anymore because it was cleaned up a long time ago. And it may be able to be reused because we migrated from LaunchDarkly, and it was probably a LaunchDarkly based one.
There you go. That's exciting. Do you just pick a Pokemon at random each time, or do you have a preferred gen?
I pick one at random. I tend to go for like, I'll be like, oh, I want a dragon one because I'm feeling dragony, or I want a fire one because I'm feeling fiery. But we actually created an internal site or two to track which ones we've used before, because so it'll go into DevCycle and see, have we used this Pokemon before and which one can be used next.
Very cool.
And it looks like a Pokedex.
Oh,
That's really
that's
fun.
great. That's amazing.
Because we have what are called First Fridays, where you can do like something in the product, like just take time out of your normal like feature work and just fix something that you think should have been fixed, or like that isn't going to make it to the product roadmap, or something that's useful for everyone to use. And that was, I think, one of them.
That's awesome. Cool. And yeah, just one last question before I throw things back to Terrane. I'm kind of curious, sort of like, do you have strict like performance requirements for your app? And like, is there a requirement for like the feature flagging system to like also perform in like at a certain level? Is that something you think about at all, or?
So when we launched in the front end, I mean, you guys made it pretty easy. DevCycle was for performant in the browser out of the box. I think there were a couple edge cases where when we didn't pass you something, or in sometimes we'd hit rate limits or whatnot. So there were some minor scaling issues, but I wouldn't say there were any actual performance issues in the browser. I know that there was a lot of talk with performance when we were looking at the backend, because we run a network and a CDN, so performance is of the utmost importance there. But for the browser, 50 milliseconds versus 100 milliseconds, and we also don't isn't that big of an issue, and we also don't block page load based on it. So things work fast enough for us, and they have been, and I think they've only gotten faster in general throughout time. So that performance hasn't been an issue. It is top of mind because we try to keep things nice and snappy, especially on first load, because it is a single page app. So things are going to be snappy after first load, but that first one can be pretty rough.
All right. So moving into more questions about the migration itself. When you were first considering moving away from LaunchDarkly, what were you looking for in your next feature flag platform?
Yeah, so I think the main things were feature parity, because no one wants to take a step backwards, and that had to do with a lot with our experimentation stuff, and like you said before, performance, especially around the network level things. But scalability within the org, which is basically the seat-based pricing, because like I've said a few times, because it's really important to us, is that empowerment with our developers is top of mind all the time. Anyone from our entry level, early career people, all the way up to our architects, should be able to be empowered to make their own changes and make mistakes, and you should be able to take down prod and fix it pretty easily. That's kind of the whole thing about Netlify, is our rollbacks are very quick because we keep a snapshot of your site for a long time, and so you can just instantly redeploy it. It should be the same thing. If you roll out a feature and it's broken, it should be as simple as just flipping a switch to turn it back. And so it's enabling everyone to do that is really truly the thing we were looking for, and not having seat-based pricing basically was enable that.
Migration project is a large thing, not taken on very lightly. What was your role that you played in that project?
Yeah, so I was asked to create the initial POC, which was basically, does this thing work? Because DevCycle was a pretty new product, and LaunchDarkly is the biggest player in the game as far as we could tell. And so does this work, especially does this work in the way we need it for the front end? I think I was tasked with this because we used the most complex feature flags with our experimentation back then as the growth team. And the answer was yes, clearly. So we moved on from there from the initial phase, and then I think it was handed over to JB, who I think you also interviewed. And I worked closely with him on the implementation and testing to make sure that not only did it work, but it worked in a way that our developers could do their jobs and do it effectively. So working on the DX around the actual physical migration itself. So would it be a total pain to have to make all of your changes in LaunchDarkly and then make them also in DevCycle for question mark amount of time, months, I think it took. But no, because their APIs and your APIs are all nice and accessible, I think either your team or JB created some scripts JB was at least enabled to make some scripts to copy everything from LaunchDarkly on a regular basis. So he would run that script, I think, a couple times a day to make sure that because everyone's empowered to do things, people from support were adding user IDs to flags that needed to be opted into things, or people from our forums were making changes, or docs. We're opening up docs to special customers who need to see docs because they were being onboarded into some beta feature that we have. And so those changes are being made by people who aren't completely apprised of our migration and shouldn't have to be. So because there was no way to tell LaunchDarkly, hey, can you just send every change we make to DevCycle? I don't think they ever want to make that feature. It was really important to us to keep those in line so that when we actually feature flagged the feature flag migration, since LaunchDarkly was the one we were familiar with and already had in place, we used them to say, if this feature flag is on for you, use DevCycle, otherwise fall back to LaunchDarkly. And so we could test pretty reliably, is this working and are our flags migrated correctly? And so, and every day we would run the scripts to move flags over from LaunchDarkly into DevCycle. And then once we would tell all of our engineers, hey, you have to migrate your things by X date. So each team would go in, migrate their flags or delete them if they were old. Again, personal responsibility to clean up your own stuff. If once you migrate something over to DevCycle, you can say, fine, this is done forever. It's in DevCycle. And you can just take it off and mark that the migration script won't bring it over anymore. And then you can just leave that one on forever. And so then at the end, when it's all flipped on, everything will be in DevCycle, and we can just then take out that feature flag and we were on DevCycle.
So basically you were sort of like continuing to use LaunchDarkly during the migration process, but then just like reflecting every change that happened on that side over to DevCycle to make sure that if like DevCycle was serving the stuff, that it would be the same as the LaunchDarkly setup.
Yeah, mostly, and I think the main impetus there was the front end did this pretty quickly because it was basically just we were just find and replace the uses of the hooks, or just change the imports of the hooks. So use flag came from a different place. Or I think the actual way JB did it was migrate everyone to use this specific use flag hook that then internally would check the flag and in the front end say call out to LaunchDarkly or call out to DevCycle right in the app. And so then it would just clean up that flag. And so one single point of flag choice. But then we also had our Go SDKs, which are either at the network level or in other services. And so those are owned by several different teams and had to go at their own pace and wait for performance issues to be worked out. And that was an iterative process just to get different services going at the same time. So it was really important to be able to like migrate the front end all at once and then say, all right, the front end is now on LaunchDarkly, is now on DevCycle, and LaunchDarkly can be ignored. But maybe that flag they're just using a flag that's used somewhere else. And so the ability, like that coordination there was probably one of the more tougher aspects, but luckily that's one of the good parts about keeping all of your services completely separate is there's not a lot of overlap, and I think that's one of our um, I guess standing orders is to like keep everything isolated.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess like were there any sort of like organizational challenges to this too? Because I guess like you're mentioning a lot of other stakeholders like support and different teams like that probably also had to interface with LaunchDarkly. Like, was there sort of like a transition period of having to like train them on a new tool? Or, like, how did that process go?
Yeah, I think so. The migration script that JB ran a couple times a day that did a lot of the heavy lifting there because, like I said, support would be adding from one place to another. And the front end ones are not really the support touching ones, so we had a lucky time there is that we could do all of our things in isolation. But then you have a lot of the API ones or the billing one flags or uh, uh, enterprise-based ones that are generally in the Ruby code, and those are touched by support a lot, or the network level ones because they need to be in this data center instead of that data center. And so I think there was there's a little, I wouldn't say confusion, but there was a little hesitancy and I don't want to say fear. I want to say like just mindfulness that that this like there are more stakeholders in this than just engineering. And so luckily we have a phenomenal support team and support engineers who understand the ins and outs of like what they're doing with respect to feature flags. So they could always say, hey, just be mindful, we use these on a day-to-day basis. And they would reach out to, because they were involved in the process. So they would reach out to whoever owns it or just yell if they didn't know who owned it and be like, we touch this a lot. You need to let us know which one we're work with us to tell us should we be updating LaunchDarkly or should we be updating DevCycle. And I didn't hear of any incidents related to it, and I didn't hear of anything blowing up. So I think that went well.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned that there are a lot of different teams that use feature flags. Are there, other than support and development, what are some of the other departments that use it?
Um, the sometimes our docs team has used it, but I don't think it's not one of the things they reach for because they don't have any engineers on the docs team. They have to reach out to someone on the front end generally to make changes because they will edit Markdown, but any of the actual like rendering engine, because it's a view press site, I believe. So they have to reach out to someone to make changes there. And I think they sometimes use some feature flags every now and then, but I think more of their release process is more around Netlify's deploys, and you can just lock deploys on a day of release and just say, all right, now deploy this branch. So more branch style, but with an Netlify flair on it. So that makes it a little easier to handle. And then I'm trying to think if there are any other teams that come to mind, because typically sales will need to add people, but they will ask support, or our sales engineers will also ask support, because the relationship there is very strong. So I think it's mainly those. We tell our product managers that they can click the button to do product launches, but I think they like to just leave that to their engineers. In my experience, that's they don't typically feel very comfortable doing that.
Do you ever have cases where there's like other stakeholders on like an upcoming feature that want to come in and maybe like preview it or something like that? Like say somebody from product, somebody from sales, or even like somebody from like the executive level that just kind of wants to like go and grab like an early view of something under development?
I would they do, but I think that most of that happens because we tend to demo things early and often. And so we have company-wide demos pretty often, and those get shown off. So if anyone really wants to like, hey, can I see this early? Either it's already turned on for everyone in Netlify, and we can just say that, and that's pretty often the case. If it's demoable, at that point you typically turn it on for everyone at Netlify, or they'll ask the individual project team to just add them separately. But that's not as common because again, typically we just turn everything on for everyone in Netlify when it's ready to, like if it's at a demoable state, demo for the whole company. Yeah, that's more common.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess like after you switched to DevCycle, did you feel like there were any sort of like tangible differences in your workflow compared to LaunchDarkly? Like anything that sort of like maybe affected your productivity, or like were there sort of like any other outcomes you noticed from the switch?
There are three that come to mind. The first one being again, the seat-based pricing just made it, because the reason we needed to migrate at all was we had this channel that we created because we only had, I think, 50 seats or 70 seats or something, and we needed to be, so if someone needed a flag change and we had run out of our seats, someone would be like, can someone please turn on my flag? I have a feature to launch. And you'd have to yell into the ether and hope someone answered. And or hey, this person's on PTO. Can I take their seat for the next week? And then yeah, and then when they come back, you have to give it back and forth. So that was pretty tangible because that was a huge headache. I can't imagine how many dev minutes or dev hours were wasted trying to give like extra seats to support or extra seats to someone who wasn't on PTO. And yeah, but that was a giant headache. But also just working in DevCycle, one of the big differences I noticed was LaunchDarkly. It wasn't entirely clear in LaunchDarkly what rules were getting applied when, because they see that it wasn't exactly the first one reading downwards. It was more just the rules had to be specific enough. Otherwise, it just might pick one of their rules. It seemed at times, which one hit first. It didn't seem to be an like a deterministic list of rules that would go through one by one. And we were extremely confident that when the rules as numbered in DevCycle would just be there. They would never reorder. They would just go through in waterfall style and say, did this hit? No. Hit the next one. Did this hit? No. And then just go to the default at the last, which was uh, a source of anxiety sometimes, because if you're launching a big feature or a big growth experiment, was my main source of anxiety, because we had pretty complex rules. So if we needed you to have three different user attributes and create your account was created after this date, I wanted to be very, very sure you were going to get this variant that I was expecting. Yeah. And then the third one was just the support, because working with, I don't think I ever got LaunchDarkly support within a couple hours of asking them, and it just never really got good support. Whereas having a Slack channel with the DevCycle team and saying, hey, I wonder if this will work like this, or this is a cool feature, and just it being there in the next week, that was very refreshing.
Nice. Yeah, we try to keep on top of Slack.
So I think that's all we had for today. Thank you so much for chatting with us. It's been really great.